Well, hey there, it's Sandy Allnock back with this brush again. If you missed my recent video, you haven't met this little guy yet. It's a brush that I bought for myself for Christmas. The price had come down on it and I thought, I'll give it a try. And it's got a beautiful brush end on it. DaVinci does make lovely brushes, and this one holds so much paint and so much water. You can watch my recent video. I did 2 of them. One is just doing the thumbnail sketches for this painting, and then the second is that painting. I suggest watching them in order, the sketches first. But today I want to talk a little bit about the other tip of it, which is the Silverpoint end. Because I was curious, knowing what I know about Silverpoint, why you would pair that with a brush. And if you don't know anything about Silverpoint, that question won't even make sense, but I will get into that. Silverpoint, which is technically metal point because you can use other metals as well. Silverpoint is how they used to draw because they didn't have sticks of graphite that were encased in wood. They didn't have pencils. So they drew in metal point. And in his instructions for painters, Leonardo da Vinci actually wrote down, always take a small booklet with you with sheets that have been prepared with bone meal, and note your observations in haste with the silver pen. So he was talking about outdoor nature sketching. And he also mentioned bone meal. Bone meal was one of the ingredients they used in a type of gesso that makes more of the silver point come off of the point and onto the paper. This watercolor paper is not doing very much because it's just paper. It's not prepared with anything. And when you're using watercolor and Silverpoint together, the only way I can think of to make it work really great would be using watercolor grounds. And I find myself incapable of painting well on watercolor grounds because the surface it makes is just not flowy the way that paper is flowy. And maybe there's a secret to it that I don't know. If you know what it is, please do let me know. But the Silverpoint does show up a little bit more on it. You can see it's a little darker. It's never going to get dark. And I'm going to be doing a whole video on Silverpoint and metal point and gold point and everything coming up in the near future. But for now, just know that you can make it a little bit darker by having some kind of grounds under it. But watercolor grounds does work if you need to use that. But you can just barely see a little bit of outlines when you do the point from this brush on a piece of paper. But this is not actually technically silver on the end of it. It's something called ether graph. I don't know what it is, but it is some kind of metal that they put on there. I'm probably not going to use the 2 of them together unless I literally forget to bring a pencil with me to go out painting. But, we have the luxury of having graphite pencils at our disposal, which is wonderful. So I'm going to be doing this painting of this beautiful pink tree. And it's going to go awry in the first half, but I promise you it will get better later. So if you find yourself holding your breath, just let your breath go. Don't hold it. You're fine. So this is iridescent electric blue that I'm using for the sky. And I'm lifting the clouds back out of the paint that I've put down because that's going to give it a nice soft edge using a baby wipe. And watch those spots for the next few minutes because I'm going to move on to a different section. And when you start trying to lift an area, keep an eyeball on it because the pigment is going to tend to try to run back into the area you just lifted. And it's going to give you weird hard edges, even weirder ones than you first painted in. But I knew that, and I knew that I had enough pigment and enough water on this page that I still have time to work with that if I need to. Because you can see how much comes off this brush without even working at it at all. So look at the upper left corner, nice hard edges starting to appear again because that pigment is moving back in. Very easy to fix. I can go and lift it again. I could have just waited and lifted it once now, but I hoped that it would stay, because sometimes it will stay in its soft edge form. And then I just grabbed my heat gun and zapped it so that it would stop moving. So always be watching the areas of your painting that are drying, because if you need to fix something, you need to do it while it's still wet. So for the flowers, I wanted to use pink. So I'm using Quinacridone Rose. Very, very, very thin wash. And one of the funny things is, as I was trying to mix a bunch of Quinacridone Rose in that well, like the brush kept sucking up all of the paint and all of the water, because this brush is so thirsty. It just wants to drink and drink and drink, and then to pour it all out on the paper. It just has so much fun with that. So it takes a good bit of practice over time to get used to it. I am still in the learning stages with it, and I'm curious to see how it's going to go and what else I'll learn about the brush and how to use it. But here I'm just going to try to put in some of the clusters of flowers, leaving some whites so that I can have some whites in the painting, as well as open areas where I can drop in the leaves eventually as well. And then, once you get the main light pink done for this, you can lighten that further by dabbing it off. So I'm going to use a baby wipe to lift some color so that I don't have, or at least the initial color that I have is very, very light. Because with flowers like this, they just are light. But then I thought, well, let me add some darker color, some contrasting pinks, darker pinks to it. So I used a towel to just suck out the water from the base of the brush, because I wanted to just put a little bit down. It's going to give me slightly more control. I can put in smaller dabs of color, but I'm doing it on wet paper. So in some instances it will be hard edges, other instances it's going to bleed nicely. And without having just a whole ton of moisture in the brush, it's easier to get small bits and pieces. And that is just something that's going to take you practice. And whatever brush you're using, whether you get this one or not, it's going to take you practice to learn how your brush works. And your brush combined with you as an artist is something no one can do for you. There's no recipe that you can always know, I should mix my paint this way in order to make something work. I wanted a darker pink color to put in just a few little pops of dark shadows in my pinks. So I mixed my Quinacridone Rose with green, because I'm going to be using a bunch of green for the green leaves and for the grass and everything. And I wanted some colors that would harmonize together. So when I do a dark pink, I'm going to mix it with green. When I want to darken my green, I'm going to darken it with pink. And the two of those together just balance each other out. It's just a matter of how much of which color you put into the mix. So now I wanted to mix up a grass green and go work on the bottom portion. And I've mentioned before that my Ultramarine Turquoise, like the one purpose it has in my palette, is to mix with Hansa yellow so that I can make the most gorgeous greens. You can mix this to a whole variety of values of green, strength of green, based on how much of the turquoise you want to put in it. But it just looks like a sunny green so easily. Like it doesn't take work to do it. You just have to, be gentle in how much of the turquoise you use, because it does like to take over if it can. So I'm going to add in a few spots here and there where the sun is coming through the tree, hitting the grass. There's going to be little tiny highlights in here, but I'm going to warn you that in the next few minutes is when this whole thing started going awry. I was not at all certain if this was going to be recoverable at a few points, and that is a very normal place for a painting to go. This is just a sketch in my sketchbook, and I was determined even when I started thinking, not sure this is going to go well, this is not coming out the way it was planned in my head. I still proceeded because I want to learn from this piece of paper. If I'm going to use the piece of paper, why tear it out of my sketchbook and throw it away unfinished? So in a painting like this, even if I was confused by what I had messed up and where I had gone wrong, then if I were to just quit now, I wouldn't learn anything about painting it again. So I figured, okay, I wanted these soft mixes in the grass. I wanted the sharp edges to be in the tree. So I thought, I'm just going to keep doing wet and wet down here. It just got worse because the pink that I mixed with green and the green I mixed with the pink just kind of turned into one brown blob. Now, they are complementary colors, or at least mostly complementary colors. They're like a one off from their direct complement. But, that's what happens with complements. They neutralize each other. That's the purpose of using them together, because your shadows are generally going to be more neutral. And so I ended up with this big brown blob. But, going to keep going anyway, because that's how we learn. Now, I also mixed up this brown color, again, from the pink and the green, so that I could see if I could get this brush to make these very thin little trunks on the tree. And as I said, a lot of it is managing the brush and how much water is in the mix and how flowy is it, so that you can get movement of some kind off the tip of the brush. You have to have enough to get the color to flow, at least some, but not so much that it gets blobby. And then it comes down to what color you want it to be as well. And if you make it thin, it's going to dry back more and dry lighter. So how do you handle that? Well, I thought I'm going to put in enough that I get tons of pigment in these greens, and then I'll dab some off and then put more back in, because then I'll at least get a couple of values of green. And again, I was not sure if this was recoverable, but I was just trying something to see what works. When you're learning to paint, or even when you're, you think you know something and you just haven't painted that thing, that subject, it just takes practice, and sketchbooks are a great place to do that. So I mixed up this horrendously crazy color. I mean, in the palette mix, it just looks wild. How that would work in the tree was beyond me at the moment, but I was just proceeding because I wanted to keep going while I was on a roll, and kept adding these darks around my clusters of pink. Now, you have to be careful when you're adding like these greens around the pinks that it doesn't look like you're outlining. And, right now it's starting to look like the green is just outlining. So I'm trying to use some very small strokes to make kind of scribbly edges on some of the greens, so that the greens move into the pink and the pinks move into the greens. Because if you were to make lines along all of those, it's just going to look funky in terms of the way the tree is constructed. And while that was still wet, I also thought, well, I'm going to add in a little bit of that same kind of detail in the pink. Just, mix up some pink. And then I was like dabbing that off and thinking, okay, I am really going off the rails here, because my brush was not cooperating. My mix was not cooperating with me. And, sometimes that just happens, and with a new brush, it's inevitable. So for all those petals that are on the ground in the photo, you can hardly see them unless you're really tuned into it, because the value of the grass, that shadow, is the same value of the pink petals. And so trying to mix a color that was going to be the same for both, so that one didn't come out darker than the other, was better part of valor. So this painting was not as bad when it was dry as I had thought it was going to be, but I decided to get out the white gouache. Now, you might be one of those like, I don't want to do gouache. I don't want to get into gouache. I don't want to know about gouache. Gouache is like a whole nother medium. I just want to watercolor. Well, I'm going to show you why you need to think about gouache a little bit. So I'm mixing just some white gouache with my pink watercolor, my Quinacridone Rose. And I can mix it to be a very bright pastel pink, because white gouache is opaque. And that opacity means I can paint over top of all of these flowers and start creating tiny blossoms. I can mix it to any consistency of color, so I can make it pinker, I can make it whiter, and I can get a whole variety of different size flowers, different values of flowers in this tree simply by changing the mix of the Quinacridone Rose and the white. And that means you've got a lot of options for fixing a painting or for getting pastels. Because you can do you don't even have to have all the colors of gouache. You can have just some white gouache that you can use together with your watercolors. You don't have to have a pink gouache to mix with your white gouache in order to use gouache. You can just use them with watercolors because gouache is basically opaque watercolor. And it's going to give you a lot more tools in your tool belt. Now, you want to be careful when you're mixing any kind of white with your watercolors because you're going to get a pastel. And you're also going to get potentially some desaturation. You're going to get brighter color because it's amped up because of that opacity of the white. But it can change color. Like it can take a color that was warm and make it suddenly feel cool. It's one of the things that makes gouache challenging, for me at least, in mixing colors because I'm used to mixing them in watercolor, not in gouache. But once you start figuring out what it does with your different watercolors, you can use it to create your pastels. If you're entering any kind of contest, competition, a show, or anything where the requirement is that it has to be watercolor, then look carefully at the rules to find out if it has to be all watercolor or if gouache is permitted. For many watercolor societies, etc., they want you to achieve a tree like this with just watercolor and not with gouache. But there are some that also permit it, so check and see the rules just so you don't get caught off guard by surprise. They do make white watercolors as well. And I actually got some recently by accident because I ordered a couple of tubes of white gouache, and the online shop sent me white watercolor instead. I even checked to make sure that I ordered the right thing, and fortunately when I called and said, "Hey, what'd you send me?" They told me to keep it, and they just forwarded on some more tubes of gouache. So I tried them. I tried the white watercolor, and it just wasn't as opaque. But it'll kind of work. So if that is what you have, then try it and see if you can, get some pastels to be made from it. Because, this effect is really nice, especially with all the spring flowers, spring trees, those kind of things. It's really helpful to have some nice bright color. Now for this pink, I could have used just the Quinacridone Rose painted over top of the greens. And it would have been kind of a brown looking color because of that. I wanted it pink, so I left the mix of some of that opacity of the white gouache so that the pink stands up against it. But I'm trying to make it dark enough that it's still going to sink into the paper and not just sit on top and be all bright and crazy. Now my color that I mixed up for the flowers here for the light coming through was way too bright. So I just dulled it down, painted over top of it. And since gouache is water soluble, I can even take my wet brush and drag some of these spots around and start to move them and soften them. And you can also wait for it to dry because gouache is going to dry a little bit darker in general. Well, not always, but it may dry darker. So give it some time so that you can tell whether or not you need to do any repair to it before you call your painting finished. So in addition to having some of the bright pink showing through where the sun comes through the branches of the trees, I wanted to have some of that green. So I mixed the same color, but you can see the instant I added white to it, that color disappeared. So I had to add more watercolor to it. So you'll have to do some experimenting with your mixes, but it really gave a nice pop to some of the highlights on the grasses themselves where the sun is filtering down there. And that is about it for my sketch. I hope this video was helpful to you, that you learned something about the brush. You'll learn more in the near future about Silverpoint, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet already and come back for that. And maybe this gouache trick will help you as well as we get into spring painting. Thank you so much. Hit the like button on your way out because it makes a huge difference to the channel. And I'll see you again very soon with a new video. Bye-bye.